The smallest kindness, given at the worst possible moment, is often the one that changes everything. The rain came down in heavy sheets that night, the kind that blurred headlights and turned sidewalks into rivers, and Emma Collins stood just inside the diner door, arms wrapped tightly around herself as the cold crept through her thin uniform. The heater inside had been broken for weeks, but she stayed anyway, because missing one shift meant falling another step behind, and she was already 2 months late on rent. Her manager's voice echoed somewhere behind her, sharp and impatient, but Emma barely heard it because her eyes were fixed on the man outside, standing alone beneath the flickering streetlight. No umbrella, no coat, just stillness, like he didn't belong to the storm or the world around him. Customers walked past the window without noticing. Cars splashed water onto the curb inches from where he stood, and for a moment Emma hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coat, the last real thing she owned. Worn but warm, the only thing that had belonged to her. Mother before everything fell apart. She could feel the weight of it on her shoulders, not just fabric, but memory, survival, a thin barrier between her and nights that felt endless. And maybe you've had a moment like that too, where you're holding on to something because it's all you have left. Maybe you're even thinking right now what you would do in her place, whether you'd walk away or step into the rain. Emma exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, then pushed the door open. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and biting. But she didn't stop. She walked straight toward him, close enough now to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet in his expression, not desperation, not even a plea, just absence. "You're going to get sick out here," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the storm. The man looked at her, surprised, as if she had broken through something invisible. "You should go back inside," he replied, calm, measured. "You'll regret this." Emma paused, just for a second, her hands trembling as she reached up and slipped the coat from her shoulders. The cold hit instantly, wrapping around her like a warning, but she ignored it and stepped closer, draping the coat over his arms before he could refuse. "Maybe," she said with a faint smile, "but not tonight." For a moment neither of them moved, the rain falling harder, louder, filling the silence between them. Then she turned and walked back toward the diner, her steps steady even as her body shivered. She didn't ask his name, didn't wait for thanks, didn't look back. Inside, the noise of the diner swallowed her again, plates clattering, voices rising, life moving forward as if nothing had happened. But something had, even if no one else saw it. Emma picked up her tray, her hands colder now, her shoulders lighter in a way she couldn't explain, and somewhere behind her, unnoticed, the door opened again. Emma did not notice when the door opened behind her, or when the cold air followed someone back inside, because the rhythm of the diner pulled her in immediately, orders stacking, coffee refills, the sharp clink of plates against porcelain, her manager already watching from across the room with that look that meant do not slow down, do not fall behind. So she moved, step after step, tray after tray, even as the cold settled deeper into her bones, her fingers stiffening around every glass she carried, her breath shallow but controlled, because she had learned long ago that discomfort did not excuse you from surviving. Not when rent was due. Not when the electricity bill had been sitting unopened on her small kitchen table for 3 days. Not when every dollar mattered down to the last cent. And tonight she had just given away the only thing that made the walk home bearable. The only thing that made her feel like she still had something left of the life she once knew. There was a moment, brief and quiet, when she paused near the counter, her hands resting against the cool surface, and she felt it, the absence, like stepping outside without realizing winter had arrived. But she did not dwell on it. She could not afford to. Instead she straightened, forced a small polite smile, and turned back to her tables. The hours passed slowly, stretching longer with every passing minute. Customers came and went, laughter rising and fading, the storm outside never letting up, and somewhere in the middle of it all, she caught a glimpse of the man again, just for a second, seated now in the far corner booth, the coat draped over his shoulders, his posture unchanged, calm, observant, as if he had always been there. She hesitated, her steps slowing, something about the way he sat, the way he watched without really watching, unsettled her, not in fear, but in a way she could not quite explain, like standing near something important without understanding why. But before she could think further, another order was called, and she moved on. When she finally approached his table, her notepad ready, her voice steady despite the quiet tension in her chest, he looked up again, meeting her gaze fully this time, and for a brief second, the noise of the diner seemed to fall away. "Are you warm enough now?" she asked, softer than she intended. He studied her, then nodded once. "More than I expected," he replied, his voice even, almost thoughtful. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Then he added, "You should not have done that." Emma shrugged lightly, keeping her tone professional, distant. "It is just a coat," she said, though they both knew it was not. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, as if weighing something unseen. Then he looked down at the menu, placing an order simple, precise, nothing extravagant, and yet everything about him felt out of place in a diner like this, from the way he spoke to the way he held himself, as if the world outside these walls operated differently for him. Emma wrote it down, nodded, and turned to leave, but as she did, she noticed something small, something almost invisible to anyone else. The watch on his wrist, understated but unmistakably expensive, the kind of detail you only recognized if you had spent years watching people who had more than you ever would. Her steps slowed again, just slightly, curiosity flickering beneath her calm exterior, because suddenly the man in the rain did not feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like a question, and Emma Collins had just realized she might have given away more than just her coat. Some people carry their past like a shadow, quiet but impossible to escape, and Emma Collins had learned to walk with hers without ever letting it slow her down. But tonight, as she moved between tables with practiced precision, that shadow felt heavier than usual, because for the first time in years, she had chosen to let something go, not because she had extra, but because she refused to become the kind of person who looked away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of a coffee pot as she refilled a customer's cup, the warmth rising against her skin in sharp contrast to the cold that had settled deep inside her. And for a brief second, her mind drifted back to the apartment waiting for her at the end of the night. A narrow space barely large enough for a twin bed and a small table, the heat unreliable, the lights flickering when the wind picked up, the unopened envelope still sitting by the door, stamped in red with a final notice she did not need to read to understand. She already knew what it said. She already knew what was coming, and yet she kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant going back to a time when life had looked different, when she had sat in classrooms instead of standing behind counters, when her mother's voice had filled quiet evenings with plans that stretched far beyond survival. But those plans had ended in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye, and everything after that had been about one thing only: getting through the next day, the next bill, the next shift. Emma blinked, pulling herself back into the present as she approached the corner booth again. The man was still there, untouched food in front of him, his gaze steady, observant, as if he was not just watching the room but understanding it. And this time, when she stepped closer, she noticed something else. Not just the watch, but the way people unconsciously gave him space, the subtle shift in posture from the staff, the quiet awareness that seemed to follow him without explanation. It was the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, and it changed the air around it. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone neutral, professional, but there was a quiet curiosity beneath it now, something she could not quite suppress. He looked at her again, longer this time, as if the question held more weight than the words themselves. "You work a lot," he said instead of answering. Emma gave a small, almost automatic smile. "That is usually how this job works," she replied, deflecting with ease. But he did not look away. "No," he said softly. "That is how survival works." The words landed differently than she expected. Not sharp, not intrusive, just accurate. And for a moment, Emma felt something shift, a subtle recognition that made her pause, because it had been a long time since anyone had seen past the uniform, past the routine answers, past the version of herself she showed the world. She straightened slightly, her voice steady. "Again, did you need anything else?" she asked, returning to the safety of the role she understood. He glanced down at the table, then back at her. "No," he said. but I think you might. Emma frowned slightly, not understanding. But before she could ask, he reached into his pocket, placing something on the table between them. Not money, not a card, just a small, folded piece of paper, simple, unremarkable. And yet the way he set it down made it feel intentional, like the beginning of something she had not agreed to, but had already stepped into. Read it later, he said quietly, when you are not rushing to the next thing. Emma hesitated, her instincts telling her to refuse, to keep boundaries clear, to not complicate a life that was already balancing on the edge. But something about the moment held her there, just long enough for curiosity to win over caution. She picked up the paper, slipping it into her apron without unfolding it. Thank you, she said, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. And as she turned to leave, she could feel it again, that quiet shift in the air, like something unseen had just begun. And for the first time that night, Emma Collins did not feel entirely in control of what came next. The paper felt heavier than it should have, even though it was nothing more than a small folded square tucked into the corner of her apron. And Emma became aware of it in a way that distracted her just enough to make her movements less automatic. A fraction slower, a detail her manager noticed immediately. Table 7 has been waiting, he muttered as he passed, not unkind but not patient either, and Emma nodded, forcing her focus back into place. But the presence of that note lingered, quiet and persistent, like a question waiting for the right moment to be asked. She moved through the next hour on instinct, her body remembering what her mind could not fully hold, refilling glasses, clearing plates, smiling when expected. But every time she passed the corner booth, she felt it again, that subtle awareness, that sense that something about this night had shifted beyond her control. When she finally returned to his table, the plate was still mostly untouched, steam long gone, the food cooling into something forgotten. You should eat, she said, not as a server this time, but as something more human, something unguarded. He glanced down at the plate as if seeing it for the first time, then back at her. I am not very hungry, he replied, his voice calm, almost detached. Emma tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way she rarely allowed herself to study anyone. Then why order? She asked before she could stop herself, the question slipping past her usual restraint. There was a pause. Not awkward, but deliberate, as if he was deciding how much of the truth to offer. Because sometimes, he said slowly, you follow routines even when they no longer fit. The answer lingered between them, unexpected and strangely familiar, and Emma felt it again, that quiet recognition, like hearing your own thoughts spoken by someone else. She crossed her arms lightly, more for warmth than defense. That sounds expensive, she replied, a faint edge of dry humor in her voice. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest one existed somewhere beneath the surface. It usually is, he said, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not in status or circumstance, but in something less visible, something that had nothing to do with money or position, the kind of understanding that came from losing things you once thought would last forever. Emma shifted her weight, suddenly aware of the cold again, sharper now, creeping into her bones with every passing minute. And he noticed, of course he did, his gaze dropping briefly to her arms, to the absence of the coat that had been there before, then returning to her face. You are cold, he said simply, not as an observation but as a fact he had already accounted for. Emma shrugged, deflecting as always. It is part of the job, she replied, but he did not accept that answer the way most people would have. Instead he leaned back slightly, studying her with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. No, he said softly. It is part of the choice you made. The words were not accusatory, not even questioning, just precise, and Emma felt something tighten in her chest. Not regret, not exactly, but the awareness of consequence, the cost that came with refusing to look away. She opened her mouth to respond, to dismiss it, to return to the safety of polite distance. But before she could, her manager's voice cut through the moment again, sharper this time. Emma, we are not running a conversation lounge. The reminder snapped the space between them back into place, and Emma straightened immediately, the professional mask returning without effort. I will check on your bill, she said, her tone neutral once more. But as she turned away, She could feel his gaze follow her, not intrusive, not demanding, just present, and for reasons she could not fully explain, Emma Collins found herself wondering not what was written on that folded piece of paper, but why it felt like it had already begun to change something she had spent years keeping carefully the same. The night did not end with a moment. It unraveled slowly, like something pulling at the edges of a life that had already been stretched too thin, and Emma felt it before she understood it. In the way her manager stopped calling her name. In the way the usual noise of the diner began to fade earlier than expected, chairs stacking sooner, lights dimming slightly, the storm outside still relentless, but now joined by something heavier inside, something unspoken. She glanced toward the counter where 2 staff members stood close together, voices low, expressions tight, and then she heard it, just a fragment at first. Inspection, unpaid lease effective immediately. The words landed without context, but her body reacted before her mind could catch up, a quiet tension settling into her chest. She set down the tray she was holding, her hands suddenly colder than before, and stepped closer, not enough to interrupt, just enough to hear. "We are closing tonight," her manager said finally. Louder this time, not addressing anyone in particular but everyone at once. "I just got the call." The room shifted, conversations faltering, movements slowing. As if time itself hesitated, Emma stood still, her thoughts not racing but empty, because there was nothing left to calculate, nothing left to adjust. This was not a bill she could delay or a shift she could pick up to compensate. This was final, and for a moment, she did not move at all, until instinct pushed her forward, one step, then another, until she reached the corner booth again. The man was already standing now. The untouched plate pushed aside, his coat, her coat, still resting over his shoulders. His gaze met hers, and there was something different in it this time. Not curiosity, not observation, but awareness, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. "You are closing," he said quietly. Not a question. Emma nodded once, her voice steady despite the quiet collapse happening beneath it. "Looks like it," she replied, forcing a small, controlled breath. "It happens," she added, though they both knew. This was not something that just happened. Not like this, not all at once. There was a pause, and then, without thinking, without the usual layers of restraint, she reached into her apron and pulled out the folded paper he had given her earlier. She looked at it for a second, then unfolded it, slowly, as if delaying the inevitable. The paper opened to reveal a single line, handwritten, simple, precise. "Come outside when your shift ends." Emma blinked, her eyes moving over the words again, as if they might change, as if there might be more. But there was not. Just that one sentence. She looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face for the first time that night. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less guarded. He did not answer immediately. Instead he reached up, adjusting the coat slightly, almost absently, then stepped closer, just enough to lower his voice without needing to whisper. "It depends," he said, his tone calm, steady, "on whether you are willing to step outside again." The words landed heavier than they should have, because Emma understood what he meant, not the literal act, but the choice behind it, the same choice she had made earlier in the rain, the same moment where logic said hold on, and something else said let go. She glanced down at the paper again, then back at him. "And if I am not?" she asked, a quiet challenge in her voice now, testing something she could not yet define. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something that suggested certainty rather than persuasion. "Then nothing changes," he said simply. "And you go home the same way you were going to anyway." Emma let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper, because for the first time all night, the cold, the job, the bills, the loss, all of it felt like it had been leading to this one moment. Not an answer, not a solution, but a decision, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and the caution and the years of learning to survive quietly, something stirred, not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it, and Emma Collins realized she was standing on the edge of something she did not understand, with nothing left to lose but the version of her life that had already begun to fall apart. The room felt smaller after that, not because anything had changed physically, but because Emma could no longer ignore the weight of the choice sitting quietly in her hand. the folded paper now open, its single sentence echoing louder than the noise of chairs being stacked and lights being dimmed. "Come outside when your shift ends." It sounded simple, almost insignificant, and yet nothing about this night had been simple. Not the rain, not the man, not the way everything she had built to survive was now slipping out from under her. She looked around the diner one more time, taking in the familiar details she had stopped noticing months ago. The worn edges of the counter, the faint smell of coffee soaked into the walls, the clock above the kitchen that always ran 2 minutes slow. This place had never been much, but it had been enough, and now even that was gone. Her manager avoided eye contact as he counted the register. Already moving on, already letting go, and Emma understood, because she had done the same thing before. When life took something from you, you did not always get the luxury of reacting. Sometimes you just moved forward because there was no other direction left. She exhaled slowly, her breath uneven in the cold air that now seemed to seep in from everywhere. And for a moment, she considered ignoring the note, folding it back up, walking out into the night the same way she always did, head down, steps steady, pretending that nothing had shifted. Maybe that is what most people would do. Maybe that is what you would do. Hold on to what little control you have instead of stepping into something uncertain. And if you were thinking about that right now, whether you would walk away or take that step, you are not alone, because Emma stood there asking herself the same question, her fingers tightening around the paper, her instincts pulling in opposite directions, one side whispering caution, reminding her that nothing in her life had ever come without a cost, the other side quieter, almost unfamiliar, asking what if this time was different. She glanced back at the man. He had not moved much, still composed, still watching in that same calm, unreadable way, not pushing, not waiting impatiently, just present, as if he already knew she would have to decide on her own. And that unsettled her more than anything else, because she was used to pressure, used to expectations, used to people wanting something from her. But this felt different, like an open door with no instructions, no guarantees, just a choice. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her breath catching slightly as the cold hit her again, sharper now without the distraction of movement. And she realized just how much she had given up earlier, not just the coat, but the small sense of security it had provided. And now she stood here with even less, no job, no certainty, nothing but a piece of paper and a stranger who seemed to see more than he should. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, the question breaking through everything else, raw, unfiltered. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the answer rather than delivering it. "Why not you?" he replied, and it was not an answer. Not really, but it landed in a way that made her pause, because it shifted. Something, not the situation, but the way she saw it. She let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "That is not how this works," she said, more to herself than to him. Because in her world, things always had reasons, clear ones, usually unfair ones, but still something you could trace, something you could explain. This felt different, unpredictable in a way that made her uneasy. He watched her for a moment longer, then glanced toward the door, where the rain still fell steadily, relentless but unchanged. "It works however you decide it does," he said softly. And there it was again, not pressure, not persuasion, just the quiet return of the choice to her hands. Emma looked down at the paper one last time, then toward the door, then back at him, the space between, staying and stepping out narrowing with every second, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the logic and the exhaustion, something finally tipped, not because she believed in what was waiting outside, but because she was no longer willing to stay where nothing was. Emma did not rush the decision. She stepped toward the door slowly, each movement deliberate, as if testing whether the world would shift beneath her feet before she reached it. The diner behind her now quieter than she had ever heard it. Lights dimmed, voices lowered, the end of something settling into the walls. And as she reached for the handle, she felt it again. That strange awareness that this night had been building towards something she did not yet understand. The door opened with a soft creak, the cold air rushing in immediately, sharper than before, carrying the sound of rain hitting pavement in steady, relentless rhythm. And for a moment, she stood there, half inside, half out, suspended between what she knew and what she did not. Then she stepped forward, the rain touching her skin instantly, cold and real, grounding her in the choice she had just made. The street was mostly empty. The storm had driven everyone away. But not everything was gone. Across the street, parked, just beneath a flickering streetlight, was a car that did not belong in this part of town, sleek, dark, unmistakably expensive, its surface catching the dim light in a way that made it stand out against everything around it. Emma's gaze lingered on it, her brow tightening slightly, because details like that did not go unnoticed by someone who had spent years observing what others overlooked. She turned slightly, looking back through the diner window. The man was no longer at the booth, and for a brief second, something like doubt flickered. Had she misunderstood? Had she stepped out for nothing? But then she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just the soft click of a door closing behind her. She turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, the coat still draped over his shoulders. But now it looked different somehow, not because it had changed, but because everything around it had. The rain traced lines down its fabric, but he did not seem bothered by it, his posture the same, calm, steady, as if this moment had been expected all along. Emma crossed her arms slightly, more for warmth than anything else, but her eyes stayed on him, searching, not for answers exactly, but for something that made sense. You said come outside, she began, her voice steady despite the cold. I am outside. He nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly toward the car across the street, then back to her, and that small movement was enough for her to follow the line of it, to connect something that had been forming quietly in the background, the watch, the presence, the way people had reacted without knowing why, the way he spoke, the way he observed. It all aligned in a way that felt too precise to be coincidence. That is yours, she said, not as a question, but as a realization. He did not deny it, did not confirm it with words either, but the silence was enough, and Emma felt the ground shift just slightly beneath her understanding of everything that had happened so far, because suddenly the man in the rain was not just a stranger, and the coat she had given was not just a coat. It was something else entirely, something she had not accounted for. She took a small step back, not in fear, but in recalibration, trying to place him, to fit him into a version of reality she could process. Who are you? She asked, and this time, the question carried weight, real weight, not curiosity but consequence. He watched her for a moment, the rain falling steadily between them. Then he spoke, his voice unchanged, calm, measured, but the words themselves shifted everything. Someone who needed to see if people like you still exist. Emma frowned slightly, the answer raising more questions than it resolved. People like me? She repeated, and he nodded once. People who give when there is nothing left to give, he said, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the rain filling the silence again. But now it felt different, heavier, as if something larger had just been set into motion. Emma looked back at the car, then at him, her mind catching up piece by piece. Because if that was true, if this had been more than chance, more than coincidence, then what exactly had she stepped into, and more importantly, what was waiting for her next? Emma felt the meaning of his words settle slowly, not like a sudden shock, but like a realization that had been waiting for her to catch up, the rain still falling around them, steady and indifferent, as if the world itself had no interest in what was unfolding between two people standing on a nearly empty street. You needed to see, she repeated quietly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him more carefully now, not as a stranger, not even as a customer, but as someone who had walked into her life with purpose, and that changed everything, because purpose meant intention, and intention meant this night had not been random, not entirely. She let out a slow breath, her voice steady but edged with something sharper now. So this was what, a test. The word felt strange in her mouth, but it fit too well to ignore. He did not react immediately, his expression remaining calm, but there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if she had stepped closer to something he had not expected her to reach so quickly. Not exactly, he said after a moment, though his tone suggested the difference was smaller than the words implied. Emma shook her head slightly, the cold biting deeper into her skin now, but no longer her focus. You were standing out there in the rain, alone, with nothing, she said, her voice gaining strength as the pieces aligned. And you knew someone would either walk past or stop. She paused, her gaze locking onto his. You just did not know which. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of confirmation, and that was enough. Emma felt something shift inside her again, not uncertainty this time, but clarity, sharp and undeniable. And if no one had stopped, she asked, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no softness, just the question. Itself, direct and unfiltered. He held her gaze, and for the first time, there was something there that had not been present before, something quieter, heavier. Then I would have learned something else, he said simply, and that answer landed harder than anything else he had said, because it revealed the truth beneath everything. This had never been about her specifically, not at the start. It had been about the idea of her, the possibility that someone like her still existed. Emma let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without amusement. So I was just proof, she said. And he did not deny it, not directly. But the way he looked at her now was different, more focused, more certain. No, he said, his voice lower this time. You were the answer. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered, because it meant something had changed after the moment she stepped into the rain. Emma looked away briefly, her mind moving through everything that had happened. The coat, the diner, closing, the note, this conversation, and now this. The realization that she had not just made a choice. She had been part of something larger than she understood. She glanced back at the car, then at him again. And what happens now? She asked, not because she expected a simple answer, but because the question itself felt unavoidable. He followed her gaze toward the car, then stepped slightly to the side, opening the space between them in a way that felt intentional, an invitation rather than a command. Now, he said quietly, you decide if that answer changes anything. Emma's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the rain still falling, the cold still present, but none of it felt as immediate as the moment in front of her, because this was not about warmth or shelter anymore. It was about something else entirely, something she had not allowed herself to consider in a long time. The possibility that her life could move in a direction she did not control, and that terrified her. More than anything else, she took a step forward, then stopped, her breath catching slightly as she looked at him again. Really looked this time. You still have not told me who you are, she said. And this time, it was not curiosity, it was necessity, because whatever came next depended on that answer. He met her gaze, steady, unflinching, and for the first time, he gave her something real, something concrete. Daniel Hayes, he said, the name settling between them with a weight that did not need explanation. Because even if she had never met him, even if she had never stepped into his world, she knew it. Everyone did. And in that moment, the final piece fell into place, turning everything that had felt uncertain into something undeniable. And Emma Collins realized that the night she thought she had lost everything might have been the night everything began to change. Emma did not react immediately to the name, not outwardly, because her life had trained her to absorb impact before responding to it. But inside, something shifted in a way she could not ignore, not fear, not awe, just a quiet recalibration of everything she thought she understood about the night, about him, about the choice she had made without knowing who was standing in the rain. She let out a slow breath, her eyes steady on his. So this is where it turns into something I am supposed to be grateful for, she said, her voice calm but grounded, not accusing, not impressed, just honest. And that was the first moment something changed in him, not visibly, but in the way his attention sharpened slightly, as if her response had not followed the script he was used to. Emma glanced toward the car again, then back at him. You give me something, a job, money, a way out, she continued, each word measured. And I am supposed to believe that everything just worked out. She shook her head, slightly, the rain still falling, her hair damp against her face. But that is not why I stepped outside. The silence that followed was different now, no longer uncertain, but defined, because Emma Collins had just drawn a line without raising her voice, without stepping back, simply by refusing to turn her choice into a transaction. Daniel watched her for a moment, longer than before, as if reassessing something he had assumed he understood. Then he nodded once, slowly. I know, he said, and there was no defense in it, no persuasion. Just acknowledgement, and that mattered more than anything else he could have offered. Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly, Not because the situation had become easier, but because it had become clearer. She looked down, briefly, then reached forward, taking hold of the coat still resting on his shoulders. Her coat, the one she had given without knowing, without asking, and gently pulled it back toward herself, the fabric heavy with rain, colder now than it had been before, but still hers. She held it in her hands for a second, feeling its weight, its familiarity, then slipped it back on. The warmth slow to return, but present enough to remind her of what she had chosen earlier. Daniel watched the motion without interrupting, and when she looked up again, there was something final in her expression, not rejection, not acceptance, just certainty. I did not give that away to change my life, she said quietly. I gave it because it was the right thing to do in that moment. She paused, her gaze steady. Whatever happens after that does not get to rewrite why. The words settled between them, simple but immovable, and for the first time, Daniel Hayes did not have an immediate answer, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing to correct. Emma took a small step back, the rain still falling, the night still cold, the future still uncertain in every practical sense. But something inside her had shifted into place, something that had nothing to do with money or opportunity or outcomes, something that felt intact. She glanced once more at the car, at the world it represented, then back at him, and there was no hesitation now. If there is something you want to offer, she said, her tone even, offer it because it makes sense, not because you think I need to be rewarded. Daniel held her gaze, then nodded again, this time more firmly. That is fair, he said, and after a moment, he reached into his pocket, not dramatically, not as a reveal, just a simple motion, and placed a small key in her hand, along with a card. No explanation, no speech, just the objects themselves. Emma looked down at them, her brow furrowing slightly, then back at him. What is this? She asked, and he answered this time without hesitation. A place that is about to close tomorrow, he said, his voice steady, and a chance to decide what it becomes instead. Emma studied him for a moment, searching for something hidden, some condition, some expectation, but there was none, just the same quiet presence she had seen from the beginning. And slowly, she closed her fingers around the key, not as acceptance, not yet, but as acknowledgement, because this was not about being saved, it was about being seen. And that was different. She exhaled softly, her breath visible in the cold air, then looked back toward the diner behind her, the lights now almost completely off, the chapter already ending whether she stepped forward or not. And when she turned back, her voice was quieter, but stronger than it had been all night. Then I will decide what it becomes, she said, and Daniel nodded once more, stepping back, giving her space not just physically, but in every way that mattered. And as Emma Collins stood there in the rain, coat wrapped around her once again, key resting in her palm, she understood something she had not fully grasped before, that kindness does not promise outcomes. It does not guarantee change, but it reveals something far more important. The kind of person you choose to be when nothing is watching, and sometimes, without asking for it. That is the very thing that changes everything.